It's been controversial, it's been in the news, and search marketing experts have had debates of its use. Today, we're taking on the Google AMP topic with the two opposing views to help you answer the question, to AMP or not to AMP. This is the Scrum.
What if you could have a seat at the table with experts as they look at the bigger picture of digital marketing? You're in the Scrum with Edge of the Web.
Welcome to the Scrum. This is a special Edge of the Web podcast, bringing a conversation to you about a select topic that really needs a conversation. We then lock and load with a couple of influencers in our industry that are best suited to take us there and unpack this topic. So we brought Barry Adams and Jono Alderson with us today. This is our Scrum today. We're going to be looking at Google AMP, looking at what we were told, what were the advantages and disadvantages, and whether there is a place for it now in today's SEO. This is the Scrum from Edge of the Web. Let's introduce our guest on the show. Thanks for joining us here on the Edge. Barry Adams is the SEO consultant at Polemic Digital. Barry's award-winning SEO consultant specializing in technical and editorial SEO for news publishers around the globe. He's been building and ranking websites since 1998. And yes, there was internet back then. I remember it. And he has also worked with a wide range of clients, from micro businesses to the world's largest media brands. He's also an independent SEO consultant, and he delivers specialized services to international media brands such as Fox, Future PLC, Investing.com, News UK, and many more. Barry, welcome to the show today.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks very much for having me. I am really looking forward to this one.
Oh, see, he's frothing at the mouth a bit, Jacob. He's ready, eager to sink his teeth into the AMP concept. Absolutely. Well, thank you. And it's the first time you're being on the show, and I am very sorry that we haven't had you on beforehand. But why not have this as the preeminent event to introduce Barry to our audience? Let's pivot around and introduce Jono real quick so we can get both on deck here. So Jono Alderson is a friend of the show. He's been on the show before about a year and some change ago. He's special ops at Yoast. He's a digital strategist, marketing technologist, and full stack developer. He's an expert in digital strategy, SEO, analytics, WordPress, web performance, structured data, marketing technology, conversion rate optimization, growth. It's like, oh my gosh, it's like he's got everything. He's a full stack, PHP, CSS, and more. He's worked with startups, agencies, and some of the world's biggest brands to turbocharge websites, implement growth strategies, and prepare for the future and, well, win markets. So, Jono, welcome back, sir.
Thank you for having me. What a delight to be back. I'm loving the setup. This is very exciting.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to have you back. Last time you creeped out our audience when we talked about machine learning and went fully into Skynet and talking about Google back then. And now we're looking at Google in another way here today. So thanks for joining us on this. And hey, by the way, you guys know each other, right? A little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. We cross paths at a lot of events and we agree on, I think, absolutely everything except for AMP.
I see.
Yeah,
so
pretty much.
So there's been this wedge between you because you are almost polar opposite on the concept of Google AMP. So why these gentlemen are here today is for that very reason. We're talking about AMP and the recent changes of what Google AMP is. But before anything else, we want to make sure that, Barry's a fanboy of AMP, right? He's been like that from 2016. Am I mistaken here?
Yes, slightly mistaken. I mean, you can type something like fuck Google AMP into your browser and search for it, and I will be the #1 ranked result for that particular query, which sort of gives you an idea of where I sit on that particular topic. I think I'm primarily known nowadays as the anti-AMP guy.
You're the anti-AMP guy. I got it. So no vacillation there. So we wanted to make sure that we brought both parties, both concepts into the stage here. So let's tee it up to our audience and let them know where we are here, if you're not familiar with AMP, Barry would probably suggest that you just move along and don't even pay attention to it. But AMP is accelerated mobile pages. They first appeared to web users in February 2016 when Google began to show the AMP versions of web pages in mobile search. So here's the stage set here. Again, Barry simply hates AMP, and Jonah is a member of the AMP advisory committee. So it's almost like I want to have like a ding ding cage match kind of thing. Anyway, here's the deal. On February 23rd, 2016, Google officially integrated AMP-powered web pages into mobile search results. AMP-coded pages appear in the mobile search results carousel at the top of Google of organic listing, and they feature an AMP icon that looks like a thunderbolt. Oh, they did. As well as the acronym AMP, right? So initially, AMP was focused on news stories for online publishers, the primary content Google search users usually see as AMP pages in the mobile search. However, AMP was also relevant to other types of businesses, such as e-commerce organizations, and for which AMP results, carousel, and other components were well suited. So we were told in 2016 that this was a platform to be able to speed up content delivery. The essence of why we were told to deploy AMP was to make sure that users could actually read that content more quickly. Can you give me the idea of what the framework of AMP is, and what were the challenges in implementing AMP in 2016, and the kind of the rate of ascendance of an acclamation, I guess, for web users starting to climb on board that? Joan, I'm going to go to you first on this.
Sure. So I'll start by conceding some ground to Barry that when it was launched, AMP was flawed in a number of respects, not least of which Google's whole approach to and strategy and requirement to incentivize publishers to implement it. Right. Initially, it had all sorts of technical problems and challenges, like you had to have a dedicated AMP template. So you would have your conventional mobile page or website and then an AMP version of it, which of course took time and resource to build and maintain and so on. That content would be served from Google's cache, which raises some technical questions around things like what happens if my product goes out of stock or I want to update the content. And have that reflected quickly, and also some existential questions like, am I really comfortable with Google being a kind of middleman and owning and serving my content, especially given the backdrop of them already wielding a lot of influence over the rest of the stack? That's definitely problematic. And there are a whole bunch of other challenges, like whilst it was ostensibly open source, it was very highly dominated by Google employees and resourced by them, and a whole bunch of other things that just made it look on the surface like it hadn't been thought through very well, and it was very much just Google forcing a lot of extra work on publishers. That said, the core of the thing still inherently was a good idea. It's very hard to build fast websites, and this was a option and a format to do that. It was just marketed and landed in the same horrendous way that Google often does with its products, that it rolls them out to a small beta without really thinking, without really planning, makes a mess, and then inevitably kills them. This is a slightly different thing, but yeah, they are not good at producting.
So, I mean, we were talking about Google Plus and that particular direction.
Oh, exactly, right? It's the same,
All right,
same story.
RIP. All right, so as developers, we were also challenged with the sheer fact that Google AMP was a stripped down version. We had no control over the aesthetics of that. We also had no control over conversion paths or any type of visual. I mean, this is on a white background, basically, or a very binary background where you could not really control anything. It was a very a reduced set of JavaScript functionality. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But you had no control to be able to flow users through the site. And ultimately, there were some additions where we could actually implement certain types of CTAs and additional JavaScript functionality. But I mean, we were reeling up back in 2016 going, how in the world, I mean, if this is where we need to go for mobile traffic and we have no control aesthetically on that design, boy, that's a lot of lost opportunity of sales and leads and engagement to other areas of the site. So Barry, pivot over to you real quick, because that's where everything started of why in the world are we ceding so much control of our user experience to Google in the name of speed? Go ahead.
Well, in 2016, when AMP was forced down our throats, we didn't really have much of a choice. At that time, Google decided that if, as a publisher of news, you wanted your articles to show up on mobile search results in those top stories carousels, which I hasten to emphasize are the primary source of traffic for news publishers. Dominant mobile experience. People read news primarily on their mobile devices. Mobile search results tend to be the biggest driver of traffic to any news publisher that has any sort of footprint in Google. And Google said, right, you need AMP versions of your articles or you're not going to get any of that traffic anymore. So publishers didn't have a choice. They had to adopt AMP or just let go of 50-60% of the traffic in some cases, which in a very competitive online sphere in general is not something a publisher was willing to do. So they had to put in the resources. They had to invest money and time and development effort into building AMP versions of articles.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, those AMP versions were very restricted, like you just mentioned, in what they were capable of. So usually they resulted in lower monetization as well, fewer ads, fewer types of ads, a limited ad landscape, which is one of the reasons why AMP now, by the way, is subject to class action lawsuits. But we'll get to that later. And it became, a carrot and stick approach where there was almost no carrot and just a really big stick for Google to wield and force publishers to use AMP. Publishers didn't want it. Nobody asked for it. Nobody thought, let's just reinvent the web and, create an entirely new foundation for the web on something that's already been around for, in that case, more than 20 years.
Right.
But Google decided, you know what, we don't like the web as it currently exists. We're going to create this new framework, which is hobbled and not particularly thought out and very, very far from mature, and just let everybody use it. And if they don't want to use it, fine. We're just not going to rank their articles anymore.
So, and I appreciate that insight. You had an article in 2018. It was literally Google AMP can go to hell. We've all read it again and again and again. It was laying out the grievances that we were all having, not only the UX side of things, but the lack of control over the layout. But on top of that, coding, you actually gave even a few screenshots regarding the different errors that were coming at you from Google Search Console as you adopted AMP, because it was basically creating an alert system of focusing your desktop or your canonical site content, and the elements had to be inside of the Google AMP layout to the degree that you kept on getting alerts and could very well get perceive it as penalization if you weren't adhering to these factors here. And you really coined the phrase there of Google wanting to see a Google-shaped web. And this is where we've had numerous conversations here on the show, is that the web is not, it has been a Wild West for the longest time, but there's so many different factors of user experience, and Google has moved itself into a space of this is what we want our users to see: fast content, very minimal artwork, and moving away from design and control, or at least that's what is perceived to be from Google. They're trying to create this. I think they got impatient, and that was part of the discussion. They got impatient with the rest of the world catching up or making a faster experience by and large. They kind of said, you know what, we're going to do it for you, and we're going to own that space, and you can't monetize for it either because it's going to be stripped down. Jonah, how do we battle against that type of perception of that overreach that Google kind of demonstrated early on there?
I don't know if it is overreach. I think that by and large, the web and the mobile web in particular is crappy. It's certainly less so now, in large because of the impact of AMP and Core Web Vitals, etc., which AMP drove the innovation for. But by and large, many websites are slow. They do provide a poor user experience. They are filled with intrusive, unpleasant ads. And by and large, the requirements that Google put in place for things like having an SSL certificate or putting content on your pages or having a meta description, etc., do improve the web by and large.
Yep,
and yes, you can absolutely see evidence that they got bored with waiting for brands to make the effort to speed up their sites and do all these other good things. And obviously, the incentives weren't there for them to do so, and they, as Barry rightly points out, they definitely got the balance of carrot and stick wrong. I think, is this an AMP problem? No, it's a broader issue around, is Google shaping the web based on their requirements? Maybe. That's a scary existential question, but by and large, it looks like that aligns quite well with give people a good user experience, don't build business models which are invasive or abusive, don't spam people. Like, all of these are things which we would want a better web to have. And whilst it's very easy to say, okay, we don't need a new standard to do all of this, we can just do this with conventional HTML. Yeah, of course we can, but we haven't, and we aren't, because the incentives and the education and the motivation isn't there. So instead, we give people constraints and a framework and say, you know what, instead of hand coding all your terrible HTML and filling it full of terrible ads, take this shortcut instead and do it the nice way, and we center in on that being a way to build a better, more respectful, more performant, useful web. I have no problem with that at all. I think most of the web is terrible. The mechanisms to make it better don't exist other than this. Maybe there's space for a competitor to AMP, something does something similar, but we need the options at the moment are either do it yourself badly or use the framework.
So, I mean, we were told that there was an altruistic perspective here to be able to give content and give speed of access, but it also started to affect the top carousel news, and we started to see more and more. And we were told that AMP was going to be preferred in that sector, which is the highest visibility on the SERP, right? So it wasn't just for speed; it was also, there was this coveted ground that mobile responsive web content could not get into. There was just a threshold it couldn't get into unless Google, your AMP was adopted on the site. So there's a scenario in which you can have that stick, but you can also have this control over here. It was not just beating sites over the head. There was this ground that was not going to be shared. And we always talk about Google Sandbox. Is it their traffic or somebody else's traffic? But when it gets down to it, if we're now being restricted from playing in certain areas because we're not playing with the tool set that Google's requiring, is that more of a currency of interacting with Google, with website content? I mean, are we now having to basically pay with our lack of control and visibility, control and aesthetics to be able to be in that coveted ground? Barry, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question for sure, and I have to disagree with Jono on several aspects of what he just mentioned.
Okay.
I don't think everything that Google wants us to do benefits websites. Recently they started humping on that people need to mark their affiliate links as UGC or sponsored or things like that. That has no benefit for websites, no benefit for users. It's purely there as a mechanism to train Google to better recognize affiliate links and user-generated content links. To a certain extent, you can make the same case for schema markup. It's not there for end users. They never even see it. It's there primarily for the search engine's own benefit. The same with XML sitemaps. It's a standard that Google heavily promoted and has invested in. Users don't care. They never look at XML sitemaps. It's purely there for Google. And Google is pulling all these levers to make the web conform to what they want it to be, rather than putting more effort, as I would see it, in making sure their own search engine catches up to what the web is doing. They're putting the cart in front of the horse, really. They're making the web adopt to what they want it to be, rather than adopting themselves to the web. And I find that's not our job. And you asked that question, you mentioned it as well. Is it Google's traffic or the website's traffic?
Right.
Nobody goes to Google to read Google. People go to Google to read content on other websites and have a very quick and effective mechanism to find that content. Google is founded on that unwritten social contract that it can scrape websites' content, their articles, their products, whatever they have, and show them in search results. And in return, websites get traffic from Google. And Google is increasingly violating that social contract and saying, you know what, no, we're going to keep that traffic, or we're going to make sure that that traffic has certain conditions attached to it so that we can pull those levers again and make websites behave in certain ways. primarily to maximize profit. Let's not kid ourselves. Google is a profit-seeking enterprise. It's publicly listed, therefore it has a legal obligation to maximize profits, and it will do whatever it can within the framework of the law, and maybe sometimes outside of it, to maximize profits. One of the theories that has been posited regarding AMP is that AMP was a way to circumvent header bidding. There were quite a few big publishers around that time who were not happy with Google's dominance on the advertising market, and they came up with an alternative technology called header bidding, which allowed them to basically have a separate auction for ad space outside of Google's ecosystem. And AMP was not allowing websites to use header bidding at all. And suddenly websites had to use AMP for mobile search results. So that sort of put the death knell to other websites adopting header bidding, and everybody had to conform to the pre-approved advertising stacks that Google would allow on AMP articles.
All right. You took me there, and I'm going to have to unpack this. I was going to hold it later on, but yeah, let's get into this, because in October of last year, there was some news release that showed that very thing. There was some unredacted antitrust claim documentation coming out of the AG's office out of Texas, where there's like 16 different attorney generals having a class action suit against Google, where they were claiming just that very thing. I want to be able to give it enough framework here that the AMP deployment was reducing the ability for other JavaScript delivered ad networks to be able to get an ad into an AMP page. They were restricting all availabilities, that header bidding like you're talking about. So from a monetization standpoint, what that means is literally in a uniform play, and AMP has been around for 5 years, they literally were removing those ad networks from being on those mobile sites, and thus those advertisers, unless, by the way, you were actually advertising on the Google network, and that could actually still pierce the veil. So, all right, there's a lot of information. We're going to put that in the show notes, but at the end of the day, was Google AMP, because we were taught as SEOs that this was going to be ranking points, this was going to be speed for the consumers. We were going to be conforming to what you want, Google, from an execution of fast delivery of content. We'll be able to get into the news. But at the end of the day, was this literally a money grab and a holding advertisers at bay? Jono, what do you think about that?
This is all part of the same problem, which is that the product launched before it was really ready. And one of the things that it didn't do when it launched was have great support for custom JavaScript, for things that loaded in the header that weren't the AMP standard, etc. At no point did it actively prevent or block any network from running adverts or doing header bidding. It just didn't have support for it yet. Now, a lot of that's changed. A lot of what we've discussed has changed and is now resolved. But yes, when it launched, it did accidentally prevent a lot of those networks from being, whether or not that's part of some grandmaster evil plan, maybe not. It's much more likely just that it's Google bungling a product launch again. But
that's a big bungle.
Yeah, but it's no different from the Google Plus bungle or the Google Wave bungle or any of the Google Reader bungles.
Yeah, but this is a bungle that just accidentally happened to benefit Google in the order of billions of pounds.
Yeah, but so do many of these. Okay, so the interesting thing about the complaint is that it is just that. It's a complaint. It's not substantiated. Nobody's seen any of the internal Google documents it claims to cite. Much of it is just accusational, and much of it is false. When you go through it and you read it, much of it is intentionally conflated. Google has refuted many of the more ridiculous parts of it. Having spent a lot of time looking at how the AMP standard works, I can take you through line by line and point out the bits that are obviously soundbitey nonsense. The header bidding stuff in particular is quite interesting because AMP does support header bidding, and in fact has its own standard which works as an abstraction layer. And I suspect where the oft-cited quote about the 1 second delay comes in is actually that AMP makes header bidding faster because it only waits for up to 1 second to consolidate all the requests it's had. So much of the noise in this complaint is designed to poo-poo at Google because it's in the interest of the Texas AG and their cronies to throw mud at the big bad guys. Like, there's so much in there that's just nonsense.
And I appreciate that. That's
So
why I
yeah,
pivot.
the Texas AG are cronies and corrupt, but Google is on the good side of history, and they're only doing it for altruistic reasons to make the web better.
Well, no, but maybe somebody senior. So it's. I think it's very, very lazy of the SEO industry to refer to Google as a singular entity. Google is a hugely complicated conglomerate organization.
Right.
And there are teams of people who I have good personal relationships with who work on the ground to make the web a better place. And their tool of choice is AMP because they believe, as do I, that a set of tooling is required to prevent brands and websites who don't know better from making things which are bad or slow. Are they funded by people who are also dealing with AdWords bidding on weapons in developing countries? Absolutely. Parts of Google are undoubtedly evil, depending on your perspective and where you stand and which bit you're looking at. I think we need to be really careful that we don't just paint this whole thing as being corrupt because, yes, maybe somebody senior had a nefarious motive alongside making the web better. We make the web better and Google also makes some money. That is absolutely fine with me.
Well said, Jonah, and that's why I wanted to take it over to you as quickly as possible because I know Barry was going to flood the lane here real quick, but that is absolutely the case. Is that Google did respond very quickly whenever that the reports were made that the lawsuit was riddled with inaccuracies in an email statement that they sent over to search engine land, and we also know that government gets search technology wrong all the time. They don't understand it. They don't understand the algorithms. They don't understand what updates actually roll through. There is a very binary and an inflammatory position because it serves government and politicians regularly in that space. So I'll absolutely drop that right there in the middle is that you've got to be able to go through the claims, go through line by line, be able to defend that. I mean, there was a Wall Street Journal article last year, a year before, that SEOs just took to task because it was built on the premise of vagueness and misunderstanding of what algorithm changes actually do for the consumer. And I'll pivot back to we'll throw that in the show notes. But the point is that you have to understand the motives of reporting and legal complaints as well in this entire thing. You cannot just operate from one particular point of view. So we'll do that as the common ground for both parties. But I do want to throw in at the same time as we knew about this new information that came out back in June of 2021. All of a sudden, Google AMP is with the core algorithm update and the performance update that came through. Google AMP was no longer required for news carousel. That had a little bit of suspect to it with this additional claim that came through the AG's office in June. They say, you know what, we're going to pull back their restrictions and actually allow more mobile traffic to actually own that space, not just AMP traffic. 4 months later, you see the AG's office reporting these particular header bidding issues and the like. So there's another wow factor right there. And Barry actually wrote an article in November going over the surge of new non-AMP visibility that all of a sudden just popped with that removal of the restrictions. So Barry, you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I thought it was very telling that the moment Google removed the AMP requirement for mobile top stories, we saw a surge from low single-digit percentages of non-AMP articles showing up there to 25% roughly of non-AMP articles showing up in top stories carousels on mobile. And I was really angry when I saw that. Because for me, that said, right, all these news websites, these publishers, are ticking all the boxes. They're doing everything right. They've got quality reporting, quality journalism, accurate news, all the right elements in place in terms of on-page and technical SEO, except they didn't use AMP. And because they didn't use AMP, they didn't bow to Google's blackmail back in 2016, or they since deleted it. They didn't get traffic for mobile. They didn't play Google's game, and Google punished them for it. And we're talking millions, probably billions of visits that were lost off the back of that. And let's not forget, these publishers didn't do this on a whim. You know, Google likes to throw a few case studies around how AMP has improved this website or that website, especially in the early days. But generally speaking, every single publisher I have worked with, when they implemented AMP, they saw a decrease in monetization of their articles. Publishers were already struggling. AMP made it worse. It made it worse because there was more effort required to maintain a separate development track for AMP articles, basically an entirely separate development track on top of what they were already doing. And then, of course, the lower monetization for AMP articles. And Google forced this down publishers' throat for the better part of 4 years, 5 years, in fact. And now suddenly Google's like, yeah, you know what? We've changed our mind. You don't need AMP anymore. We've got a new shiny toy called Core Web Vitals. We're just going to be looking at that instead. I wonder how long we as an industry, and I mean the web industry as a whole, are going to be putting up with that crap. How long are we going to let Google walk all over us and dictate what we should and shouldn't be doing? Google doesn't own the web. The Google actually needs the web more than the web needs Google. There'll be a next search engine if Google disappears tomorrow. People might start using Bing or DuckDuckGo or Yandex or Neva or whatever new comes along. We don't need Google, but if Google doesn't have the web, Google has nothing. There's nothing for Google to show. There's no content there for Google to show. We've got this dynamic all wrong. We see ourselves as being highly dependent on Google, whereas it's actually the other way around. And we need to understand that power dynamic a bit more and be a bit more robust in our defenses against Google and their continuous transgressions, because AMP isn't the first time they stepped out of line, and it certainly wasn't the last time when they tried to assert dominance over what the web as a whole should be doing, and they continue to do it in different ways, sometimes with good intentions, I'll admit that, but sometimes also because they see dollar signs pop up and someone has a quarterly profit target to reach. I think we need to find ways to maybe combine the strengths and the voices of all these different little sectors within the web industry and be able to form a united front against technology companies. And Google is one of them. Apple is another one. Amazon's another one. It's all the big boys who probably grow a bit too big for their own good, who need some sort of resistance to keep them on the straight and narrow, because, as they say, power corrupts. Ultimate power is kind of neat. And Google definitely has ultimate power at the moment.
If only there was some kind of open source standard and platform for defining and managing what a better version
it's called
of websites should
HTML.
look like.
You don't need to reinvent it.
We're not reinventing it. We're building
You
a
are
set of
reinventing
rules
it.
and
AMP is
constraints.
just another iteration of HTML. It's the same old shit with a different label on it. You're reinventing
You could say the
something
same
which already
about
can do the
jQuery.
job just fine.
But they can't do it just fine. All the evidence suggests that the average website, the average business can't build and maintain a performant website. And even if they can, it comes with enormous cost, developer resources, education, time to manage it, etc. We're not
It's a
suggesting
problem
we replace
that's already
HTML.
being solved in other areas. You don't need Google to solve it for you. All that Google really
Google
needed
aren't
to
solving
do was
it.
put a bit more
It's
emphasis on load speed as a ranking factor, which took them 5 years to bloody well figure out. But if they did that from the start, websites would be forced already to make faster, more responsive websites without Google shoving an immature, incomplete standard on everybody's throat.
Yeah,
All
I
right,
agree
Joe.
completely. The usage of AMP as a requirement in the carousel was a bad call and a bad play, and it was far too soon, and it wasn't ready for it. The incentive, theoretically, the objective was always just constrained to fast sites, and AMP was the only mechanism we had to define that. Now with Core Web Vitals, etc., which in large has been developed as a result of AMP's innovation, etc. Now we can be much more open with that.
Go further with that, Jonah, please, if you would, because I mean, we're getting signals from Google understanding more about our own performance. In all frankness, they're giving a reflection back that we've never really seen before, except at the developer level. Now, more and more advertisers, more and more web content owners now understand performance is imperative, and we're getting more better factors of understanding that. So why don't you elaborate on that? Because I don't want to be completely anti-Google here. This is the space in which we make our money, but at the same time, we don't want to be completely hamstrung and constrained. So what do Core Web Vitals give us now to improve our sites?
So there's some interesting stuff happening in the space. For the first time, as you say, we have a quantified way of determining how performant a website is. which suddenly unlocks the ability for businesses to prioritize, to invest, etc., in a way that historically, yes, everybody knows that quality and speed and accessibility and UI are important, but how important versus other priorities and constraints. Now we can put numbers on that, we can trend it over time, we can do it versus our competitors. A lot of the Core Web Vitals metrics and mechanisms came from work done on AMP and will continue to drive forwards. I think one of the interesting things that nobody's really clocked is that the Core Web Vitals mechanisms and metric set, A, are open source, and B, are changing and evolving over time. So there's an ongoing cadence of releases and updates, which are driven by experiments in AMP and elsewhere. But there's more metrics coming. So it's not just speed and performance, it's a much more broad definition of quality. We're getting smoothness and responsiveness in this year later, although they may be merged into one, which will measure like how easy is it to interact with this site as I scroll up and down it. But these measures will evolve into something much more holistic around, is this website good? And yes, you can absolutely see a trajectory where Google rely on that more and more in more parts of Google to determine if a site should be eligible for certain types of content, where it should rank, etc. Yes, Google are heavily involved in this standard. They resource a lot of the engineering to ship the standards. But overall, I'm quite happy living in a world where we have a distinction between a good website and a bad website. And if Google is spending the money on making that happen, then fine.
You're absolutely right. Is that it is a good thing, or at least could be argued as a good thing that there is a company that can actually do this type of engineering at scale that actually does benefit organizations worldwide to be able to understand their performance, because at the end of the day, it's the user experience that we're all trying to improve. I do have one last contention, and we covered it actually on the previous Scrum here. It's the usurpation of content off of a website. To your point, Barry, Google does actually want users to read Google. They're actually putting content on the SERP. They're scooping up different extracts and answering questions on the SERP to actually eliminate the factor of going one more click down and actually find that answer. Into the degree they're even appropriating different pieces of information from different sites and answering a question, and not even citing the actual original source, because it's pulling together and merging different references to be able to answer a question for those users. Now we also understand there are utilitarian questions that don't really need that next level, like what time of day is it in Israel and in Eastern time, right? So we understand those needs, and it's being more useful for the consumers, but it is appropriating a lot of content without a lot of citation and references. It does want you to use its SERP as the resource to actually even commerce, because we're seeing shopping going through the local packs. We're seeing so many more functional aspects of content being used to create transactions now than ever before on the SERP. So I have to contend there is that they're training users to use Google more for Google, not the content that Google's representing. So Barry, Jonah, thoughts? I'll go with Barry first.
Yeah, it's a dangerous slide that they're going down. I mean, I fully agree for simple facts like, how big is the planet Jupiter? You don't need to go to a website to that. You can find it on Google. I'm very happy Google provides those direct answers. Nobody has a vested interest as a website, or shouldn't have a vested interest as a website, in providing those sorts of facts. That's just, the nature of reality that we live in, and Google is perfectly entitled to provide those sorts of answers directly in search results. But the moment Google starts moving those goalposts along, and they've been doing that quite rigorously, especially in the last few years, and lifting content from websites that potentially can be very dangerous if read outside of the context of that website and the full article.
Yep.
We get into real tricky waters right there. We get into a real potential problem where people read something on Google search results that's not accurate, and even might be factually wrong. And there have been plenty of examples in recent times in Google's featured snippet is the wrong information or the wrong answer to a specific question. Some more egregious examples, but also some examples that are quite subtly wrong. Yep. And it's not up to Google to do that, Google still needs to, I believe, send traffic to those websites, because those websites put effort into creating that content, in creating those answers. It's not just standard facts of life. It's not just basic facts that you can find anywhere. People put effort into that. They research things. They write stuff up. They put together opinion pieces. They read different source materials, and then write a piece of content to answer a specific query. And for Google to then take that content and repurpose it without permission, without attribution sometimes, and present it on the search results, accurately or not accurately, outside of the context of the entire website it's lifted from, that's very, very dangerous. And I don't think anyone benefits from that. Not Google, not end users, and definitely not the websites who produce the content.
Jonah, thoughts there?
Similar. I think there can be good use cases, though I think there are a lot of scenarios where in a better executed version of this, I can imagine having a really good user experience, searching for something, consuming the information, taking the action, buying the thing in the search results, and that being less friction than having to pick a website from a list of results when I'm not necessarily an expert in the area, understand what I'm seeing on a page I'm not familiar with, go through all the cognitive load of having to process that page, read the text, etc., etc. I think in publishing it's even harder, but definitely there are flavors of this that could be good. And this is difficult because today all of our business models are wedded to the idea that I chase tactics that drive clicks to my website. Maybe that's not the only way, maybe it's not the best way. Maybe there could be a different relationship with Google where there's some kind of licensing model. Maybe we need more controls over things like, okay, if I put certain markup in my schema, you can have this excerpt or this snippet, but then you have to attribute me with this text. A lot of this feels like there could be a model here which could benefit everyone, but Google isn't playing. And a lot of what we see with the legal constraints that they've had to put in, was it last year or the year before, where they expanded the Meta Robots directives to include whether or not you can have different snippet lengths?
It was last year.
Is all a response. Was it? Wow, that's shot by. Is a response to this. And they don't seem to be willing to provide any more control than, as Barry said, there's no way to opt in or out. You can opt out. You can say, robots textbook my entire website, but then you get no traffic. And there's no sensible middle ground where you can sort of license snippets and stuff. So yeah, this is on Google it's either on Google to find some kind of way to make it mutually beneficial, or it's on us to find new business models which don't rely on dragging lots of clicks to our websites. But that's hard.
It is hard. And you're right. There should be a new model where we can actually I think there could very well be a place where we can communicate our intent, what can be used and what can't. Right. And that was the entire legal dispute in Australia with the news organizations. But what did Google do at that point in time? They decided to not provide search to Australia on news items.
Well, there was a very, very brief moment in time. And actually, the publishers got what they wanted because Google ended up backing off. And actually, now they have licensing agreements in place with news publishers in Australia.
Absolutely.
It goes to show if you stand your ground and don't bow to Google's blackmail, there's a good chance you end up winning.
But does it have to be that that level of polarity? I mean, shouldn't there be a common discourse that, and I'm not trying to be warm and fuzzy, because when it gets down to it, you do have to break a few eggs to actually find that omelet that we're trying to create here. And there are conflicting motives across the board. But if you're rewriting my titles of my documents that I've actually worked on again and again, and I'm in the medical community, we legally vetted all those titles, and you're rewriting them because you think that this is going to be better suited for the user. Okay, we have to have a timeout here and discuss what is this all about, Yeah,
that sucks. And this is something that schema could definitely solve, right? But they're not playing. They don't seem to be interested.
Google doesn't seem to respond well to demands of that sort of open dialogue. Google only seems to respond when you throw lawsuits at them, which is why we end up with lawsuits against Google, because it's the only language they understand. And I really wish we didn't have to do that. I really wish we had other channels where we could have this dialogue with Google. Because yes, I am known as the anti-AMP guy, and I have strong opinions against Google. I love Google as well. I use them every day. The search results are fantastic. I love what they're doing with Core Web Vitals. I genuinely think that's making the web a better place for everybody. I just really wish they didn't have to use AMP first to try and accomplish that.
Right.
And yes, like you said, if we can have an open dialogue with Google that doesn't require an army of lawyers on both ends, we need to make that happen.
Yeah, because you
So
know what?
it exists.
Lawyers are relatively idiots too, right? And they won't understand the complexities. Lawyers and politicians, if we're putting them in the middle of actually trying to work this out, boy, we are picking the wrong people to actually move in front of us. So sorry, Jonah, go ahead.
On the AMP side, that channel exists. I have a fortnightly chat with a bunch of Google people where we discuss what we're doing, how it works, what the roadmap is. It's an open source standard. It's an open group. Everybody is invited. Nobody turned. No, it is. It's completely open. It's run by the OpenJS Foundation. I think of the 7 or 8 people who are usually on the call, maybe 1 or 2 of them are from Google. I have as much influence as the other people do on there. It's an open discussion. Everything gets weighed and implemented or not. I'm regularly
there was
involved
someone
in.
who joined you on the advisory committee not too long ago who disentangled themselves from it because they still see it as, as a Google pet project.
Yes, Jeremy Keith, who is who joined with the intent of being antagonistic because he's built a reputation on being anti-Google and antagonistic. His specific complaints were around aspects of the AMP standard which were still embroiled with Google, which is absolutely correct, and it's something that I've spent a year discussing and we're gradually untangling. We are, for example, moving the AMP JavaScript file from the Google CDN hostname that it's on at the moment to an OpenJS one. That takes some time because there's some technical complexities. There are 100 other examples of areas like that. Like at the moment, for example, we struggle to get any good analysis on how many and what types of sites are using AMP because the repository is on a Google domain. So we need to unpick all of that gradually. Those are precisely the kinds of conversations I'm having instead of sitting on the sidelines and complaining that Google's driving the agenda because I'm too busy complaining, so Google are driving the agenda. All of this is open. It just requires people to get involved and turn up and to state their opinions and to discuss them. There is no demon here.
John, it's much easier to bitch and complain. I mean, come on.
There we go. And there's something that the SEO industry. Well, yeah, and the SEO industry is myopically focused inwardly and on competing. And yes, that's understandable. But if you spent 5% of that resource working on the standards and platforms and infrastructure that powers the broader web, including the things that all of your clients are using or could use, or inventing things and pushing standards forwards, then everybody benefits and the web as a whole benefits. I'm in a privileged position to be able to spend some of my time doing things like talking about AMP and turning up at AMP meetings. But there's no reason why, for example, a SEO agency shouldn't spend a small amount of time on contributing code back to WordPress, or on turning up to these types of meetings, or on documenting a bug in jQuery, or 1,000 other of these types of areas which benefit them and their clients and the future of the web as a whole. Or we can just sit back and complain that Google are making all the decisions just because we're not there. Like, what is the alternative? It's not Google being evil and controlling it. It's us choosing not to be involved in the narrative.
I think you just called us out, Barry.
No, I don't agree with what he's saying. There's very limited channels and opportunities for people to influence what Google is doing with the web. AMP was nominally open source for a very long time, but entirely Google controlled only until very recently with this advisory committee and their move to open source when AMP was already becoming almost obsolete as a standard. Name me a channel which we can use effectively to influence how Google manages featured snippets. We've been trying for the last year with many examples, and all that we get are some snarky tweets from Danny Sullivan saying, nah, it's working as intended, we'll keep your feedback under advisement. There is no toing and froing there. There's no reciprocal communication channels in that at all. And that's the norm for Google. AMP now is the exception because Google is divorcing itself from AMP because they realize it's become an absolutely toxic brand and they don't want to be associated with it anymore because everybody hates AMP with very few exceptions because of the whole history and baggage that it comes with. So yes, Google has several projects where you can influence them and give your input, but those are all very carefully managed walled gardens like AMP, and the rest of Google remains this massive black box where Google is impervious to any feedback and in fact almost deliberately obtuse when it comes to feedback and input from external sources because they don't trust those external sources. They think only they have the wisdom to create the future of the web as they see it, and nobody else should be allowed to have any input on that.
Yep, agreed.
right.
And their broader comms strategies suck around that. Like huge amount of respect to Gary and John and Martin on Twitter, but having
Absolutely.
3 arbitrary engineer support people respond to some tweets based on their personal opinion is not a communication strategy with the web. Right, and the documentation is poorly maintained and non-conclusive. You're absolutely right. There are very, very few places and ways that we can have meaningful dialogue around a table. All the
Hey,
more
wait. I think that was
to use it when we
sarcasm you
do.
were throwing out there. Hold on a second.
But like we should take advantage of the places where we do have an open invitation and
Right.
where that is possible, and use that if we can to get leverage elsewhere. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not necessarily a perfect situation, but it's better than nothing.
And kudos to Google for what they've done with that trifecta. They're regularly communicating. They've been on the show multiple times, and they were helping. I mean, John's been doing that for years, helping developers on the Christmas Eve as well as New Year's. I mean, they're communicating. Now, there's a level of PR that is happening at that particular moment, not just true code support. And there's always a particular level of vacillation on any specific issues because they gotta be able to pull back a little bit here, but. We have seen a good deal of new communication coming out of Google over the last 3 years that we've not seen before. But when it gets down to these type of scenarios that we're talking about today, unless you know where to go, like Jonah has gone into his particular council, right? The doors aren't really open regularly, and there's not welcome mats there for joining a consortium of influencers to be able to help change the course of Google products. It doesn't really match up completely, but I mean, it's great to be able to see what you're doing regularly in that space, Jonah.
Yeah, and you're right. Wouldn't it be nice if more of it was like this? But I completely agree with what Barry said. Is so much of how they operate is completely closed because they know better, and it's impossible to gain access to that. And the relationship with the SEO community is so combative. Even like I do a lot of stuff in the schema space as well, and it is exactly the same story there. It is so hard. I have so much evidence of stuff which is broken or conflicting or wrong or harmful or any other number of issues, and there's no way to address that other than tweeting into the void and hoping that some arbitrary employee cares enough or sees it and decides they're going to champion it. That's not a strategy for growing a better open web. Really frustrating.
Yeah, that's mass chaos, and it's adjudication by not even the masses. I do want to say I highly recommend that if there's anybody in government listening to these type of shows, we need advocacy of individuals in the industry that are not part of any conglomerate and not part of any large entity in big tech. There's an entire group of SEO professionals that can help guide these conversations. Barry Schwartz should absolutely be in the middle of that, talking about what he knows over the last 19 years in this industry. Having lawmakers arbitrarily guide by reactionary principles that could also be inflamed by different parties. I mean, there's no sage advice there in the space to be able to create law. Would you agree? Either one of you. Barry.
Absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
I think it's very dangerous when lawmakers bow to the whims of lobbying companies. And we see many examples recently where there have been lawsuits against big tech, where people who know how tech works just roll their eyes and like, oh my goodness, what are these people thinking? What kind of questions are they asking? There's been some congressional hearings in the US that are so cringe-worthy, you couldn't even begin to describe it. And that's, I understand why these congressmen aren't tech people. They aren't involved in this, so they don't know what questions to ask. They don't even know what they don't know.
Right, exactly.
But that's where topic experts come into play. And that's where we need to be very careful that big tech isn't lobbied to death by big media or big e-commerce or big whatever it is, but that it actually has the best interests of the whole population at heart. And we're going probably into more of a philosophical area of divorcing money from politics. which seems to be fairly impossible anywhere around the world, let alone in the USA, where most of the big tech companies are based. So, but yeah, if we can have more informed conversations with lawmakers so that they can start asking the right questions and hopefully get the right responses. I think in many cases, just the fact that lawmakers start asking the right questions can be sufficient to make big tech change their ways, because they realize if they tread too far down a specific path, to get more than just a slap on the wrist off the back of it. Sometimes asking the questions is enough, but it does mean we need to ask the right questions that are formulated in the right way and founded on a good understanding of what the technologies are actually doing and what they're not doing.
Very good, sir. Very good, sir. So we're going to wrap up. Jono, what are your thoughts about additional set of individuals that can actually help guide lawmakers, just like Barry was talking about here?
I think it's really needed. It's something we've talked about in the WordPress ecosystem a bit, but not really solved. So WordPress is now powering something like 43% of the web, or at least the head of it. But there's no representation of that anywhere in lawmaking. You're looking at foundational underlying infrastructural technology. It's not radically different from the water that flows through our pipes or the electricity that comes through our cables, but it's completely ungoverned. And yeah, big business is definitely influencing politics in all sorts of weird and wonderful and probably unhealthy ways without any kind of voice from the other side. I think it's really, really hard to solve this because we don't have the access, right? And that's the root of the problem. You can't get the access. You need to be asked to the table to some degree, or you need to unify a whole bunch of people with disparate interests who are very, very busy, far too busy to say contribute to the AMP standard, and ask them to spend more of their time contributing to arguments that we're already on the losing side of. It's such a tough ask. But yeah, we need to, even just working out what our stance is, let's ask the whole SEO industry. What should we demand from government or Google or states or locally, etc.? Where do you even start? What's our agenda? What do we want?
Do you think we could ever agree?
Absolutely not.
All right. All right. So we'll wish for a better, more unified SEO world, but I think at the essence of it, there's a native combativeness that kind of restrains us there. But we need to be able to get these type of messages out, and this is what this show's about: is to be able to talk about these, be able to have these type of conversations, and come away with it with a little bit clear understanding of what are the factors that are in place. So last points here, gentlemen. I want to give you a last round of what would you say to the audience listening to this about AMP, about the utilization of AMP in the future. Jono, I'm going to go with you first. As the advocate of AMP, what are you looking at here? Do you still use AMP? Would you recommend that going into the future?
Yeah, I built my website on AMP using the AMP plugin for WordPress. It took about 20 seconds to do, and it is as close to a perfect website as I've ever seen. It gets better whilst I sleep because employees from Google update the code using cutting-edge standards that even I, as a CSS nerd, have no idea about. Like, I go to bed, I wake up, and employees of Google have worked to make my website rank better in Google. That's pretty cool. I think we do need to be careful when we talk about AMP to say, what exactly do we mean? Are we talking about Google's implementation of AMP? Are we talking like Cloudflare has an AMP cache system, Bing supports AMP. There's also AMP for email, AMP ads, web stories, which have millions of users. So it's quite a big ecosystem that's worth looking at. I will just finish and say, we've talked a lot about the mistakes that Google made with AMP and the problems that were around early in the days. I think it's worth noting that AMP is now completely open source and part of the OpenJS Foundation. You no longer build a separate template, so all those engineering concerns go away. You just build using AMP HTML, which is an extension of HTML, which is something HTML is designed to do. You can opt out the cache system. You can almost host your resources locally, which makes it even faster. And the Bento AMP website launched about a week ago, which is bentojs.dev, I think, which is AMP as a JavaScript component library without the validation rules. So you can just go, I want a carousel, I want a navigation, plug, play. My developer's an idiot. It doesn't matter. All they've got to do is copy this code and it works perfectly. It's a very different beast than it was. I think it is the singular and as of yet only way that you can reliably build and maintain a perfect website, short of having a set of employees who are even more up to date on the latest HTML spec than I am. and spending all their time nerding out around what's coming next and implementing that on the fly. I don't think you can build anything to that standard without it. So yeah, pretty cool.
All right. So Jono says he's got a perfect website. Just want to make sure everybody heard that. No, that's great.
I will buy drinks and treats for anyone who can find anything empirically wrong with my website.
Drinks and treats.
Go for it.
All right. Thank you very much, John. Barry, what are your final thoughts here on the AMP discussion?
I think I've said most of it already in the course of this conversation, but yeah, if you have a 5-page website that nobody ever looks at and serves no real purpose other than as a showcase of how awesome you are, by all means, use the AMP framework to build that. If you have a meaningful website that actually wants to accomplish something, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's something, a technology that's been around for 25 to 30 years, which accomplishes that just fine, called HTML. And you can do that whatever you want. It's not subject to any master technology company who wants to impress its vision on the world. Anybody can use it. It's very easy to learn, very easy to code. And it does everything you need it to do and then some, especially if you expand it with some simple JavaScript libraries. But that's an entirely different topic, which also is full of pitfalls, so let's not go into that today. I, for one, am very happy to see AMP become just another framework, which is exactly where it's headed at the moment. It's just another web framework, which has its advocates and people who will swear by it and carry its banner. But in the end, that's all it ever should have been in the first place. Just another web framework, which should have been entirely optional for people to use. And because of the history and baggage that AMP has, as long as that AMP brand still exists, I don't expect an awful lot of people to wholeheartedly adopt it. It's too toxic. It has too much history, and there's too much bad blood there between Google and the web development community as a whole. And which could be a shame, because now that it's reached more or less maturity, I have to admit, it's not a particularly terrible framework. I do still think it's sort of reinventing the wheel to a certain extent, a wheel that doesn't necessarily need reinventing. But on the other hand, if you build your website in AMP, it's not going to be an absolutely terrible website, that's for sure. But yeah, it does come with that baggage and that history of it, and it always is going to raise some eyebrows. And it might take 5 or 10 years for people to forget that to a certain extent and actually see it as its own independent framework that people can use to build awesome websites with. But I, for one, am very happy to see publishers especially starting to abandon AMP and focusing more on core web vitals and general usability and load speed, now that they're no longer forced to use AMP, because it has been an incredible burden on news publishers for the last 5-6 years. A lot of resources taken up by implementing AMP, maintaining AMP, that could have been spent elsewhere. It's enormous amount of cost for the publishing industry for no good reason at all.
All right, gentlemen. I'm sure you guys can agree to disagree, but I do appreciate the empowering positions that you both have. Thank you so much for coming together and talking about this. It's a very important topic, and it's a very strong philosophical topic as well that I wanted to bring to the equation. So thank you very much for your participation there. We want to let our audience know where to track these gentlemen down to have arguments with them individually or together. You can follow Jono on Twitter at Jono, Jono Alderson, on Facebook, Jonah.Alderson, and LinkedIn, Jono Alderson. And Barry is on Twitter at B Adams, as well as Barry Adams on LinkedIn. Gentlemen, thank you so much for a robust debate about Google AMP. I appreciate it. I don't know if we have a winner here, but you certainly pulled together. Barry's pointing at himself. So thank you very much for your time today. And you're always welcome back to unpack more information about what you guys do. Anything else that we can promote for you right now? I just wanted to make sure I got that in. Jono, anything we can promote for you right now?
I should promote. Yoast SEO has just announced that we are launching Yoast for Shopify on January 18th, which is about a week from now, which is pretty cool. All the stuff that Yoast does in WordPress, but in Shopify, yada, yada, pretty awesome. Spent a year building it. It's going to be great.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. We just covered that on the news this week. In fact, we have a poll out there right now of who's benefiting more, Yoast or Shopify in this combination. So kudos to you guys on that. Barry, anything that we can promote for you right now?
I write an irregular email newsletter on optimizing websites for Google News called SEOforGoogleNews.com. Please subscribe. I can't promise when my next one goes out, but there's an archive of about 12 or 13 editions there so far. That's free to read for everybody. If you're interested at all in how news publishers have to optimize for Google News and top stories, do subscribe.
Very good. Very good. Again, thank you both for your participation today, and we'll certainly be following you from afar, and you're welcome back anytime.
Thanks again.
Thanks
Great
very
fun.
much for having us.
You're more than welcome. More than welcome. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to The Edge of the Web on YouTube. And if you're really feeling up to today, let us know how we did on this episode with a quick review on iTunes. Thanks to our sponsors. And make sure you check out all the must-see videos and much more insider information over at edgeofthewebradio.com. That's edgeofthewebradio.com. Remember, from all of us, stay safe, stay well, and do not be a piece of cyber driftwood. We'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.